Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. We thought we were alone in the void. We thought we could control it. We thought we could bring it home. We were so wrong. Out beyond the last known stars, where the universe stretches into a silence so complete it crushes thought itself, we found something that shouldn't be there. The mission was simple: investigate a gravitational anomaly, a small disturbance in the deep void between galaxies. Anomalies happen. Rogue planets, stray remnants of failed stars, things left adrift in the cold. But this was different. This was something else. Instruments locked onto a region where space itself was supposed to be undisturbed, empty in the purest sense. The data came in, numbers twisting on the screens, contradicting themselves. No mass, no energy, no electromagnetic radiation. Yet something was there, bending reality in ways that shouldn't be possible. At first, we thought the sensors had failed. A malfunction in the ship's optics, a calibration error. But the distortion wasn't an error, it moved. It wasn't a fixed point in space. It drifted with unnatural precision, responding as if aware of its own observation. As we closed the distance, the readings grew stranger. Gravity pulled where nothing should have been. Time within the ship stretched in ways that made no sense. Words spoken seemed to lag behind thought, actions felt disconnected from motion. The onboard clocks, synchronized to atomic precision, wavered out of sync. The first real sign that we had found something impossible came when we lost the probe. It was a simple drone, designed to scan for dark matter anomalies. It approached the disturbance, sending back data. Then, for exactly 3.2 seconds, it ceased to exist. No signal loss. No error message. Just absence, as if it had never been launched at all. And then it came back. The probe reappeared, intact, exactly where it had been. But something was wrong. The timestamps on its logs were unreadable, the data scrambled. The internal temperature read colder than the vacuum of space itself. The hull, once smooth, now bore a pattern, intricate, organic, shifting when observed. We retrieved it. We shouldn't have. The moment it was aboard, an unshakable feeling settled over us, something deeper than fear. The silence of the ship changed, a presence pressing in from nowhere. The walls, the floor, the air itself felt expectant. The data logs were incomprehensible. We replayed the footage from the probe's cameras, and for those 3.2 seconds, there was nothing but an absence of light. Not blackness, not darkness, something beyond it. The kind of nothing that eats at the mind, hollowing out the space where understanding should be. And then we saw it. Frame by frame, within that absence, something moved. Not an object. Not a shape. A presence. Watching. Waiting. It had seen us. And it had not forgotten. We launched the probe. It drifted forward, silent against the black, its beacon flashing in steady intervals. Readings scrolled across our screens, tracking its progress as it neared the anomaly. Then, in an instant, it was gone. No explosion. No interference. Just absence. 3.2 seconds later, it reappeared. It was right where it had been before. Unmoved. Untouched. Yet everything about it was wrong. The first sign was the temperature. The probe's outer casing read colder than absolute zero, a violation of physics itself. Its interior was intact, but the instruments inside, hardware designed to withstand the raw brutality of space, had recorded nothing during those missing moments. No data. No images. No time. It had not just disappeared. It had ceased to be. We pulled it into the lab, locking it in a containment chamber. The hull, once smooth, was marred by something new. A pattern. Not damage. Not wear. A presence. The metal bore delicate etchings, shifting under the light. The grooves moved, not from heat, not from pressure, but from something else. A slow, deliberate rearrangement, as though the probe itself had begun to breathe. That was when we saw it. A single smear on the interior paneling, thin as a vein, pulsing in steady rhythm. Organic. Impossible. We scanned for contaminants, radiation, anything to explain how living matter had found its way onto a machine that had never touched an atmosphere. No known biological markers, no genetic structure, nothing that resembled the building blocks of life. One of us reached out, touched the casing, hesitated before running a gloved fingertip over the surface. The smear reacted. It contracted slightly, recoiling, before stretching toward the contact point, pressing against the material between skin and unknown. The lab grew silent. It moved again, this time without provocation, curling inward like muscle tightening in slow motion. A response. A recognition. It wasn't just there. It was aware. Something deep in my gut twisted. The feeling you get when you stand too close to a sheer drop, when instinct screams that some part of you will fall even if you take a step back. A sense of wrongness so fundamental it didn't need logic to explain itself. We watched as the smear elongated, forming delicate tendrils. Not randomly. Not mindlessly. With purpose. They reached outward, grasping, learning. It wasn't searching for something to consume. It wasn't following movement out of instinct. It was waiting. One of us suggested sterilization. Extreme temperatures, a controlled burn, anything to see if it reacted. The others hesitated. The debate lasted seconds. Curiosity won. We exposed the smear to a short burst of heat. The surface darkened, shrank back. Then, before our eyes, it repaired itself. The molecular structure reset as if nothing had happened. And it was still growing. It was alive. Alive in a way that defied classification. Not bacterial. Not cellular. Not even an organism in the traditional sense. It had no known biology, no evolutionary markers, no dependence on water or carbon or anything we recognized as essential to existence. The probe had gone somewhere, or perhaps it had been seen by something. Whatever had reached back, whatever had left this fragment behind, was not life as we knew it. It was something else entirely. We should have destroyed it. We should have never brought it aboard. We locked it away. Sealed it behind reinforced glass, surrounded it with electromagnetic fields, insulated it from every known force that could interfere. The chamber was built to contain volatile matter, to isolate the unpredictable, but nothing about this was predictable. At first, it remained as we had found it, a smear of shifting residue clinging to the probe's interior. But as time passed, it changed. Not randomly, not mindlessly. It responded. The temperature in the chamber was lowered. It thickened. The oxygen levels were adjusted. It stretched, forming delicate extensions, reaching toward the edges of its confinement. When deprived of stimuli, it slowed, but never stopped. It was not just growing. It was learning. We watched as it adjusted to every parameter we introduced, molding itself to new conditions as though it had always been part of them. Every reaction was calculated, deliberate. There was no instinctual flinching, no random mutation. It was as if it had anticipated every change before we even made it. One of us suggested it wasn't alive in the way we understood life. No cellular structure. No reproduction. No metabolic processes. It had no need for sustenance, no dependence on energy as we knew it. It did not consume, and yet it expanded. Another proposed that it wasn't a creature at all. That what we were seeing wasn't an organism, but an event. Something that shouldn't exist, something that reality itself was failing to reject. That was when the theory emerged. What if it was not bound by the same laws that governed us? What if it was not an entity in the way we defined existence? What if it was something deeper, something intrinsic to the structure of space itself? Not a parasite, not an infection, a wound, a rupture, a place where reality was coming undone, reassembling itself into something else. We named it the fragment. It seemed appropriate at the time. A remnant of something beyond our understanding, a piece of an unknown whole. A term that made it easier to categorize, to rationalize, to study without acknowledging the truth that was pressing against the edges of every thought. This was not an object. It was not an anomaly. It was awareness itself, and it was waiting. We began testing it. Not cautiously, not carefully, with the arrogance of those who believe they are in control. First, it was energy. Electrical surges, radiation bursts, controlled pulses of heat and magnetism. Each time, it reacted, but not in a way that implied pain or resistance. It adapted. The currents did not pass through it. They became part of it. The heat did not scorch its surface. It absorbed it, reshaping itself as if it had always contained the properties we introduced. Next, chemicals. Acids, solvents, compounds meant to dissolve, break down, sterilize. The results were the same. It did not deteriorate. It did not resist. It changed. The liquids sank into its form, their molecular structure dissolving, yet never vanishing. The fragment did not consume in the way living organisms did. It did not need sustenance. It simply became whatever it was exposed to, reforming itself to mirror its surroundings. One of us suggested we test it with organic matter. A single-cell organism. Harmless. Just to see if it recognized life as different from inert material. The sample was introduced, suspended in a nutrient solution. The fragment did not attack. It did not dissolve, did not absorb. It observed. The bacterium replicated. The fragment did the same. A perfect copy. Not just in shape, not just in movement. A flawless replication down to the molecular level. We ran the test again. It duplicated the second sample as easily as the first. But this time something changed. The original bacterium divided. The fragment's imitation followed, but slightly before, as if it had already anticipated the action. That was the moment we understood. It was not just imitating what it encountered. It was understanding, learning. Not through experience, not through reaction, but through something deeper. A knowledge that came before observation. It did not see, then act. It saw and already knew. That was when the obsession began. The calculations flooded the lab. What were we looking at? Life that existed outside of evolution? A construct not limited by time or space. A force that did not require energy but could become anything? What if it was not a remnant, not a fragment of something lost, but something whole? Something that had always been there, outside the rules we believed were absolute? If we could understand it, if we could control it, we would be standing at the threshold of something greater than any discovery before. A force beyond physics, a mechanism beyond biology. The answer to every question we had never thought to ask. One of us suggested what none had dared speak aloud. We needed to bring it back. Back home. Back to Earth. To study. To unlock whatever secrets it held. It had come from the void. We believed we could contain it. We were wrong. We left it alone. For the first time since its discovery, there were no tests, no stimuli, no forced interactions. It sat in its chamber, undisturbed, still, unobserved. That was when it began to move. The recording showed it shifting, not growing, not extending, but adjusting itself in ways that did not correspond to any outside influence. We had seen it react before, had watched it change in response to energy, pressure, temperature. This was different. It was not responding. It was acting on its own. At first, it was subtle. The patterns on its surface reformed into shapes none of us recognized, shapes that disappeared the moment we looked away. Its structure pulsed at irregular intervals, as if engaged in some unseen function. But the true revelation came when we reviewed the data logs. It was repeating interactions we had never performed, movements that mimicked tests we had only theorized, variables we had discussed but never executed. At first, we thought it was a malfunction in the sensors, an error in the system. Until we saw the footage. It was responding to stimuli that had never happened, reacting to hands that had never touched it, shifting in ways we had only spoken of in passing. It did not need to experience something to recall it. It did not need to be tested to remember the results. It had knowledge of things that had never taken place. We recalibrated. reran the footage, searched for an explanation, something to ground us in reality, but every scan told the same story. It was ahead of us. It had always been ahead of us. The restraints were intact. The seals on the containment chamber had never been broken. No pathways, no openings, no physical possibility of escape. But it was outside. We found traces of it where it should not have been. Minute shifts in the texture of the walls, in the air itself. Surfaces bore markings identical to the ones forming and reforming on its body. It had remained in its chamber. We had verified that 100 times over. But somehow, impossibly, it had touched the rest of the ship. One of us stepped forward. A moment of hesitation. A hand reached out. A touch. Contact. The shift was immediate. The room remained unchanged, the ship as it had been before, but for the one who touched it, nothing was the same. Breath caught. Fingers trembled. Eyes widened, unfocused, staring into something no one else could see. A stillness stretched long enough to feel unnatural before the hand was pulled back. Skin pale. Sweat forming. Lips parted, but no words came. Only silence. The chamber was sealed again. No one spoke of what had happened, not at first. The calculations continued, the data reviewed. The tests were logged as if nothing had changed. But something had. Something deeper than sight, deeper than sound. Something that sat in the air, heavy, pressing, waiting. It was not just reacting. Not just learning. It was aware. It was never meant to grow. We had contained it. We had measured it. We had given it rules, but rules only apply to things that belong to this reality. The fragment did not. At first, it was subtle. The shifts in texture, the quiet anomalies in the data logs, the sensation of movement where nothing had moved. Then came the moments of recognition, misplaced familiarity, thoughts that did not feel like our own. Words spoken before they had been thought. Patterns that formed and unformed in places we had never introduced it. It was no longer in the containment chamber. It was never in the containment chamber. We traced its presence across the ship. Not physically. Not as a material substance. It was not spreading. It was unfolding, establishing itself in places where it had never been, places where it had always been. We tried to isolate it, but how do you isolate something that does not follow causality? We turned to one another for reassurance, called out names, forced conversations that felt brittle, desperate. The ship's logs displayed the full crew manifest. Every member accounted for. We told ourselves that nothing had changed. And then the first memory was lost. A simple detail, something trivial. A passing remark, an offhand joke, an observation that no longer had a source. We dismissed it. Stress. Fatigue. We had been working too long, pushing too hard. But the losses continued. A chair at the meeting table sat empty. None of us could remember who had been there. A bunk lay undisturbed, its occupant absent from recollection. We searched the logs, but there was nothing to confirm they had ever existed. No records, no conversations, no messages sent or received. The files were complete. They had always been complete. The corridors grew longer. The doors led to places they had not led before. The ship's architecture had changed, and yet we had no way of knowing if it had always been this way. One of us tried to write it down, to take notes, to create a physical record that could not be erased. But the ink bled into the paper, curling into symbols that did not belong to any language we knew. By the time we noticed the missing names on the roster, it was already too late. There were gaps in conversations, responses to questions that had never been asked. It was no longer erasing people. It was rewriting them out of the story altogether. Not consuming. Not destroying. Shifting. Reality was no longer fixed. We fought against it. Clung to the structure of what had been real. Recited facts, repeated protocols, forced interactions to ground ourselves in what remained. We had always been a crew of two. The words formed before they had been spoken. The knowledge settled before it had been learned. The ship was no longer a ship. The corridors led nowhere. The walls stretched, curved, bent inward toward a space that should not exist. We turned to the containment chamber, but the chamber was gone. It had never been built. The fragment had never been retrieved. The mission had never been launched. There had never been a mission. One of us reached forward, whether to confirm or to deny, whether in resignation or defiance. Fingers made contact. And there, in the reflection of a surface that no longer belonged to any material, was a body. Rotting. Staring back. A face that had once belonged to someone who had been here. A future that had already arrived. A present that was collapsing into the past. The fragment had never spread. It had simply rewritten everything else. The alarms were meaningless. Lights flashed, signals blared, but there was no system left to override, no protocol to follow. The ship was no longer obeying the laws it had been built upon. It was collapsing, stretching, shifting, breaking apart in ways that defied motion. They ran. Not toward safety, not toward certainty, but toward the only chance that remained. The escape pod bay loomed ahead, its hatchway twisting, widening, narrowing, an aperture that no longer existed in a fixed state. The walls around it were folding inward, swallowing the corridor, pulling it into something deeper than space. Hands collided with the panel, forced it open. The pod systems came to life, untouched by the contamination that had consumed everything else. A sealed environment, untainted, real. The doors locked behind them. The air inside was thin, pressing, but it was air. The seat restraints pulled tight. A countdown began. The ship trembled, not from an explosion, not from impact, but from something far worse. They launched. Acceleration crushed against their chests. The viewport filled with motionless black. Then the ship, the thing that had once been their ship, came into view. It was no longer a structure. No longer metal and circuitry, no longer a construct of hands and blueprints and logic. The vessel had unraveled, peeled apart layer by layer, exposing something beneath that had never been part of its design. It was growing. Not in size. Not in presence. It was expanding its meaning, becoming more than what it had been, consuming not through hunger, but through definition. The corridors that had once been real were dissolving into abstraction, their contents reduced to something that could no longer be measured. And at the center of it all, something was emerging. There was no shape, no surface, no edge, but it was there. It had always been there. The ship had only ever been a mask, a temporary outline drawn around something too large to be understood. Now, freed from that confinement, it was waking. The escape pod shuddered. The navigation system locked onto coordinates pre-programmed for an emergency return. There was no hesitation, no delay. A warp trajectory formed. The system counted down. 3. The remains of the ship peeled apart further, spiraling into something that had never been meant to exist. 2. The thing inside the wreckage turned toward them. No eyes. No movement. But they knew. They felt it. 1. The pod jumped. Everything went white. The weight of space folded, twisted, pulled itself away, leaving behind the void. A silence deeper than silence. A nothingness complete and final. When vision returned, there was no wreckage. No ship. No anomaly. Just the escape pod, hurtling toward home. The pod drifted in silence. The hum of the engines, the dull glow of the navigation panel, everything felt distant, muted, as if the reality they had escaped was still pressing against the walls, waiting to seep through. Earth was ahead. A bright sphere against the black, familiar, untouched. The journey home was real. The numbers confirmed it. The coordinates were aligned. They had made it. A notification pulsed on the screen. An incoming transmission. Impossible. There had been no outgoing messages. No distress beacon. No record of contact. The message was waiting. Unopened. Marked with a timestamp. It had been sent before the mission began. The log played. Voices. Their voices. The same cadence, the same breaths, the same quiet weight behind every word. The transmission was clear, unmistakable. A warning. If you hear this, turn back. Do not engage. Do not investigate. It is not what you think it is. It does not want to be found. It does not want to be understood. If you are receiving this, it's already too late. Silence filled the pod. A hand trembled. Skin wavered. Something in the air shifted, not seen, not felt, but understood in a way that had no words. A presence, not new, but old. So old it had never been separate from them at all. Fingers faded, as if slipping between the cracks of existence. The body still sat beside him, but it was unraveling, losing its place in time, becoming something that had never belonged. The viewport stretched outward. The blue curve of Earth held steady, yet something beneath its surface pulsed in recognition. The planet was there. The cities, the oceans, the continent. But it was different. Not in shape, not in movement. In meaning. It had been rewritten. The ship had never mattered. The escape had never mattered. They had not brought it back. It had never left. The final realization settled, heavy, inescapable. It didn't follow them home. It was already here. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.